Hey, everybody. We are talking about developmental psychology. And so we are going to dive into how you became you. Um, you can read through what you need to know on development here on your own. I'm just going to move ahead. When we talk about developmental psychology, we're talking about the study of the physical, cognitive, and social changes that a person makes throughout the span of their life from uh, womb to tomb, as they like to say. Um, and development itself is that sequence of age related changes that occur as a person progresses from conception all the way to death. So, uh, we'll be looking at how our thinking, feeling, behavior, all of those things change, and we'll be specifically looking at the concepts of nature versus nurture, which we already talked about, continuity versus discontinuity, how we develop, and then stability versus change in terms of personality. So let's dive in. We've already talked about nature versus nurture, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the basic idea is: are we born hardwired due to our DNA to be who we are going to be, or is our environment, is it the people and the things and the events around us that make us who we are? And when we look at this issue, we tend to focus our attention onto certain types of evidence. Specifically, we look a lot at twin studies where we take two uh, identical twins, especially those who are separated at birth and grow up in different families, different environments, and we use those case studies as a way of determining, hey, what is hardwired, what similarities do these two individuals have, and what seems to be malleable. What about their personality seems to be dependent on environment rather than genetics. We also look at adoption studies where you take children of one genetic family tree and you place them into another environment, another family, and then compare those children to their genetic parents or genetic siblings, and see what effect the new environment had on them as people. So when we talk about continuity versus discontinuity, we're really asking the question: do people slowly and incrementally develop cognitively, emotionally, physically, or do they move through these distinct steps, these distinct stages along the way where there's a huge increase in capacity from one stage to the next? Now, the continuity view basically says that over a lifetime, a child will every day be, a little bit more mature, a little bit more developed, a little bit more capable, um, in every facet of their life, and that slow, gradual, constant development will uninterrupted move them into adulthood. That's the idea of the continuity view. One good example probably of the continuity view would be physical development, right? Most of us develop and grow at a fairly constant rate. Some of us, had huge growth spurts at one period or other, um, but most of the time we just have this gradual growth. The discontinuity view says that we hit these distinct age specific stages where we have a huge increase in capacity, um, and that each stage carries with it this whole new host of abilities, and then within that stage there's there's development, and there's growth, but each stage marks this distinct increase in ability. And a good example of that would be if any of you have like younger brothers, sisters, or cousins, and you helped them learn how to read, there was probably a really specific period of time where they went from not being able to read to being able to read, where the idea of making sense of letters and sounds and words was just totally beyond them. And then it's almost like the next day, it all just makes sense. And they have that ability to start forming words out of letters and what have you. So the discontinuity view looks at development that way, where on Tuesday you're not able to do some specific skill, and on Wednesday all of a sudden you have this cognitive leap, and you can do that thing. Now maybe you don't do it very well, but you have the ability to do it, whereas in the previous stage you didn't. Several of the theories that we look at, or we will look at in this unit, are going to be based on this discontinuity view. We're going to look at Sigmund Freud, his psychosexual stages, mark these distinct advancements in development, Piaget's cognitive development, Erikson's theories on development. All of these are stage specific abilities, and we'll take a look at them more closely later. But they very much fall into this discontinuity view. From a more unscientific position, parents a lot of times talk about their kids going through these different stages. You hear parents talk about, the terrible twos, or these different specific periods of time where their kids changed dramatically, their behavior changed, or their cognitive ability, ramped up. And while these stories are probably not overly scientific, they certainly lend to the idea that it appears from mere observation that kids really do go through these huge changes in capacity from one stage to the next. All right, stability versus change has to do with personality. And this really falls in line with that nature versus nurture question. Are we born hardwired with our personality, or does our personality develop and grow based on our environment? So do you come out of the womb exactly who you are, or does your home life, school life, friends, family, do those things influence who you're going to be? Most psychoanalysts would say that, the first few years of life, Freud would just say the first really 2 years of life. Most psychoanalysts would say probably within the first 3 or 4 or 5 years of life, our personalities end up developing mostly into who we're going to be. Change theorists say that our personalities are being modified all the time. They're being adjusted based on the needs of the situations that we find ourselves in. Developmental psychologists would say that's kind of a combination of the two, that things like temperament, whether you're introverted or extroverted, those things are probably pretty stable. You're either born with them, or they're locked in those first couple of years of development. But other aspects of our personality are more malleable. So, how we interact socially, those things can change based on the situations that we're born into. So we're gonna talk quickly through prenatal development. And I'm going to link a video that you guys can watch on this as well. But an awful lot happens in the first couple of months of your existence. And so when we're talking about the prenatal period, we're talking about everything that happens from that moment of conception up into your birth. That first month or so is known as the neonatal period, and then the next 36 weeks is known as infancy. So that prenatal period is also broken into 3 stages. We'll get to that in just a minute. Um, Everything is going to play out according to uh, a genetic plan that is housed inside your DNA. It determines how your organs are formed. You see this little animation here on the right. Um, all of the cells that make up a zygote are known as stem cells, which means they have totipotentiality is the term scientists use, which means they can become anything. So you're looking at this grouping of cells here. Some of those cells are going to be, part of the baby's brain. Some might be part of its heart. Some might be part of its foot. One of those might be a toenail or uh, no idea. Those cells can turn into anything that they want. Later during development, heart cells will only be able to make more heart cells. Foot cells will only be able to make more foot cells. But at the very beginning of development, all cells that are developed or created are created as stem cells, and they're created through the process of mitosis, which is when this small lump of cells known as the zygote begins to divide over and over again. It first divides into 2 cells and then 4, 8, 16, blah, 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 blah. And it goes on from there. So, whoops, sorry, guys. When we talk about development, there's a number of different terms we have to be familiar with. One of those terms is age of viability, which means the age at which a baby can survive outside of the womb. Now, as you might guess, age of viability is changing all the time. So 200 years ago, age of viability was probably like 8 months, right? But with modern technology, that number just keeps getting made smaller and smaller and smaller. And today, as many of you probably know, preemies that are born, 5, 6 months old, can survive. And so the age of viability keeps getting moved back farther and farther. And it's utterly dependent on technology at this point. It's not dependent on the capacities of the baby because, we can keep babies alive. Whereas in, earlier times, they wouldn't have made it. Drug use during this period of development can be profoundly negative on the baby. As you already know, I'm sure, fetuses inside their mother are protected in this giant fluid bag known as a placenta. And most drugs that are consumed by mom pass through that placenta and get to baby. We talk about the blood brain barrier. Most drugs that mom were to take passes through that blood brain barrier and gets to baby, which is why, if mom goes out and has 4 or 5 glasses of wine, she's making baby very drunk. Anything that passes through that blood brain barrier is known as a teratogen. That's any chemical or virus that can get through the placenta and reach the fetus. One of the more serious issues that babies can face during this period of development is known as fetal alcohol syndrome. If mom drinks regularly during pregnancy, the effect on baby can be severe. Some effects of fetal alcohol syndrome are low birth weight, stunted development, underdevelopment of the brain, and then certain parts of the face can be disproportionate, especially around the upper lip. Sometimes you get that cleft lip as a result of FAS. Smoking is also really um, dangerous for babies. It can lead to miscarriage, stillbirth, premature babies being birthed prematurely, other complications, and even sudden infant death syndrome if the baby survives pregnancy or the birth. Here's some other carcinogens and the effects on the baby. This is probably more for your own interest. I don't know. You might want you're probably going to want to know about fetal alcohol syndrome. Probably that's it. Okay, so in terms of development, when we start at the very beginning, we talk about the zygote. So you've got egg from mom, sperm from dad. They come together, and you get this first zygote. This PowerPoint and in most textbooks will talk about, you start off as a one-celled organism. That is actually not true at all. I left it in there just so I can make this comment. The egg is one cell organism. The sperm is a one-celled organism. When they come together, they create a two-celled zygote. So you were never a one-celled organism. That's not true. At the very, very earliest moment of your existence, you were a two-celled organism. And that didn't last very long because almost immediately that zygote divided into 4 and then 8 and then 16 and 32, blah, blah, blah cells. And you rapidly expanded after that. Once that zygote is formed, it begins this process towards finding a little home in your mom's uterine wall. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, those zygotes fail to attach, and that's sort of the end of their story. Less than half of zygotes make it through the first 2 weeks. Those that do make it find a spot on the uterine wall to attach themselves, and once they're attached to that wall, they begin working on the creation of the placenta. Basically, that little zygote, that little ball of cells that you saw in that little animated video, none of those cells actually will become babies. So I should have been more specific. All of those cells are going to become the placenta, and then that placenta is going to make a little pouch in the middle of itself, and it's going to start dividing cells that will eventually become the baby. So it's almost like the zygote creates a little baby factory, and then inside the baby factory, you end up getting a baby, if that makes sense. So it's significantly more complex than we tend to talk about it, but from start to finish, it's a remarkable process. After that zygote attaches, you get to you start this process known as the prenatal period. That first 2 weeks is the germinal stage of that prenatal period. Then you move on to the embryonic stage, and after 2 months, you get to the fetal stage. So let's take a look at these phases. I already kind of talked about the germinal stage, so I'm going to move on to embryonic. Once that embryo attaches itself to the uterine wall, you have rapid development. Very early on, you have the development of a tiny little heart, brain, tiny little going to be lungs, and by the end of those 2 months, you even have little buds for ears and eyes. Baby can begin to actually recognize sight and sound. And after those 2 weeks, once you hit week 9, we begin the fetal period. And this is the part where the baby is basically just cooking. All of the integral parts of the baby are already there. They're just profoundly underdeveloped, and they spend the next, 7 months developing, growing, building, all of those things until you have a bouncing little baby that pops out. So you can see at 40 days, you just kind of got this lump of tissue. But just by 45 days, you already have the beginnings of a heart. You have the formation of a brain. You can start to see designations that are going to become legs and arms. By 2 months, you have internal organs. You actually have a rudimentary eye. You have another rudimentary nose. By 4 months, you can see there is a rib cage. There's clearly formed hands and feet, fingers and toes. You have you've lost that little baby tail that exists early on that makes it look more like a shrimp than a baby. But you very much have a tiny, tiny, tiny little person by 4 months. Okay. I think that we are going to stop right there, and we will continue with the development after birth next class. So, guys, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.